You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and you're about to hear my conversation with Cyndi Mesmer, in which we address the simple question, did the people who harmed me really mean to do it? As you will hear shortly, answering this question is more important than you may realize. Because if you are unsure about the answer to this question, or if you are convinced that your parents didn't mean to hurt you, it will be very difficult for you to heal from your wounds. Being clear about the intentionality of those who harmed you, in other words, realizing that they meant to do it, is essential for you to be able to access grief and anger, both of which are necessary for healing. Okay, here we go. All right, I am here with Cyndi Mesmer. Cyndi, it's good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
You are so welcome. Thanks for joining us. Say a bit about who you are, what you spend your time doing, where you live.
Sure. I am a wife. I am also a mother of 5 children. I have 5 kids, ages 23 to 13. All of which, due to COVID, are all in my house all the time. I'm a therapist, a mental health therapist. I've been a therapist for 25 years. I also I have another job. I work for the Allender Center, and I have been a part of the Allender Center for quite some time. Right now, I am a teacher, a facilitator, trainer, and supervisor for the Allender Center. It's actually where I learned a lot about how to actually see people well, how to engage trauma well, how to understand people's stories and how it affects them and how that then shows up today. I think when I first originally was part of the Allender Center, I did counseling very differently than how I do it now. And I parented differently than I did now and lived life very differently. So the Allender Center is a very important part of my journey and has changed how I engage people in my practice. So have super fun. I love being a therapist. It's like one of the best jobs in the world. I also get to run story groups.
So we're going to talk today about intentionality. In other words, did the person who harmed me really mean to do it? Lots of people get detoured on the healing journey by the notion that my mom didn't mean to do it. And we have numerous excuses for those who harmed us. You know, my father wasn't cruel. He was just clueless. He was oblivious. Or my mother didn't covertly sexually abuse me. She didn't realize she was looking to me to fill her emotional needs. She didn't know how much this would damage me. Or my parents, they didn't mean to neglect me. They just didn't do emotions. You know, they were unable to engage emotionally. They came from a generation of people who didn't do emotions. And on it goes. My father wasn't intentionally being abusive when he made those sexually suggestive comments about my body. He was a jokester. And on. And you and I in our practices, we've heard like these excuses like legion.
Yes.
They are inevitable. So I think as a person, certainly this was true for me, engages the ways they've been harmed, a question inevitably comes up. And the question is, are you saying that my mom intended to hurt me?
Yep.
Are you saying she meant to do it? When my dad would make those sexually suggestive comments about me before I went out on a date, are you saying he was doing that intentionally, like that he was trying to sexually abuse me? And there's immense pressure inside of us to explain our harm in any way other than they did it on purpose.
Absolutely.
So let's start by defining our terms. What do you mean when you talk about uncovering intentionality?
Yeah. I am aware that people don't want to come anywhere near naming what is true about our parents, right? Or what is true about the people that have harmed us. And so I think sometimes what we end up doing, even as therapists, is we shift the conversation away from intentionality to impact. Like, how did this impact you? Which is actually super important that we actually engage and address. How did this harm impact me? And so there's goodness and there's value that comes from doing that. But what I have also found is that we stay away from intentionality. When I say intentionality, what I mean by that is that the person that did the harm, did the act, did it on purpose.
Right.
Like did it on purpose. There's a difference between people that harm and there's premeditation that happens with that. Okay? Because there are times in which people harm us or have harmed us when we are younger or even when we're older, and there's premeditation for that. So premeditation really just means like, hey, I had a plan ahead of time. I kind of thought about it ahead of time. I came up with maybe some details ahead of time. Premeditation is always intentional.
Right.
Always. Right. What's odd is like you would think in hearing somebody's story, like if we're sitting down with a friend or we're engaging somebody that's sharing a little bit of their trauma, we would think that people would automatically see the premeditation that actually they're laying out. But what's true is sometimes there can be overt premeditation to abuse, and still we have a hard time naming that intentionality, that premeditation.
Yep.
I'm mindful of like just many, many, many stories in which people have sat down either with me personally or even in a group setting, and they've read a story and you can actually see the specifics of how the premeditation is outlined,
right.
How it was perfectly like strategically planned. And yet the person that's reading the story still has a hard time naming that as true.
Yeah. Like a father who brings a towel to wipe himself off after he masturbates in the car with his stepdaughter who's 8 years old. There's a towel.
Yep.
There's a towel there.
Yep.
It's in the story. Why is there a towel there? Because he knew what he was going to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or maybe a time when a mother leaves her son in a room with a father who has repeatedly been violent with her child. And she intentionally, purposely, and premeditatedly leaves the room.
Right.
So absolutely. Knowing full well that there's a high probability of harm happening. So premeditation for me, there's always intentionality in that. So even though it seems like it would be easy for us to take in and swallow, we don't. We still need people to name that for us. Like I'm aware of just even in my own story, in which I had an experience of being sexually assaulted, like for decades, I blamed myself for that.
Right.
And I blamed myself for that because I thought like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe I gave mixed messages, or all sorts of reasons why. And it wasn't until I actually sat down with like a group of people that cared well for me in the context of my story, where they were able to name some of the particularities of the setup, right?
Right. Yeah.
And once they name them, it's like, oh my God, right. It's so clear. How did I not see that, right?
And so relieving.
So relieving. And what's hard is it brought so much grief too.
Right.
I can look back on that particular story and know, oh, that assault was premeditated, right?
Yep.
And therefore it was intentional.
Right.
I also think there can be intentional harm without premeditation. And that's, I think, where we sometimes get stuck too. When there's harm and it's intentional, but there maybe wasn't premeditation involved in it. When there's no overt premeditation to the harm, it makes it even harder to name intentionality. And intentionality just means that the act that's done is on purpose.
So what's an example of intentional harm that's not premeditated?
An example would be, I'm in a bad mood today because my day was really stressful, Adam. And I go home and my husband asks me a question and I am mad at him because he didn't do what he said he was going to do today. And I make some sort of snide, rude remark. Okay. If I'm being honest with myself, I intentionally wanted to harm him. Now,
Right.
I wasn't actually probably driving on the way home going,
Right.
how can I make him pay for whatever? That's an intentional harm that doesn't involve premeditation. But there's tons of examples of in our stories and the stories that we listen to where there is harm and it's intentional, and it's really, really hard for us and the folks we get to walk alongside to name it as intentional.
Yeah.
Super hard.
Why is it important that we do that? In other words, why is it important that I believe my mom really meant to do it? Why do I need to get clear that my dad's harm of me was on purpose?
I think when we experience harm, especially when we're younger, but I think it also happens when we're older, that we usually turn on ourselves amongst trauma. We blame ourselves for that trauma. And that can be for a number of reasons that we'll blame ourselves for the trauma. Maybe we've been involved in a grooming process, right? Where somebody has groomed us for a very long time. And then we feel complicit in some way. And so we blame ourselves. Or maybe actually we were told an incorrect narrative about what happened. A lot of times by a parent or by somebody that's mentoring us, could be a coach, could be a teacher. And so we're told an incorrect narrative about what really happened, or maybe there's context that's left out of a scenario. I also think we as children desperately want to keep the view of our parents like as good.
Right. So that we can feel like the world is safe and predictable and I'm okay. My family's okay.
Absolutely. My family's okay. The world's okay. Like some sense of even though it's false or imaginative, like some sense of control.
Yeah.
For healing to happen, there needs to be a place where the responsibility or the blame is actually placed on who is responsible. If it's not placed on who it's responsible, then I think us as professionals or helping people or friends, if we're not thorough enough to actually name who's responsible and that it was intentional, we really run the risk that the trauma survivor will be living with a life sentence paying for a crime that they didn't commit.
Right. Which is what happened to you with that sexual assault for decades.
For decades. It never even dawned on me that there was premeditation, but also that it actually was an assault. My story is not uncommon where, right, we've gone the majority of our life without actually truly naming abuse or harm or assault. So I think it's like so important to name intentionality. And it's risky. If you're on the other end of trying to name intentionality for another person, right, there's a lot of pushback. I mean, I remember being in the Allender Center and my facilitator's name was Trapper. Love Trapper. He's brilliant. But I remember him naming some things in particular about intentionality regarding my mom. And I was so furious with him. I was so mad at him. And I was mad at him because I actually needed to believe the narrative that was told to me. And I needed to believe it because without that narrative, it brought so much grief.
And so in that sense, he was taking your mother from you.
Yes. And setting me up, really, I had to actually come to terms with going, oh my, I really was an orphan. I really was all on my own and had to figure out so many things on my own, which set me up for the assault later.
Yeah.
And so intentionality is so important to be named, and it's hard to hear. To be honest, it's really hard to hear.
Yeah. Someone recently said to me something along the lines of, my parents are good Christians, and I am not going to say they did their best, but they really tried.
Yes.
Why do we do this, Cyndi?
I think it's hard to hold the complexity of who our parents are.
Yes. Say more about complexity.
Yeah. I think it's hard to hold that they hold goodness and that they are depraved people. I think it's hard for us to hold, like it wasn't too long ago where I had to tell somebody, like, I don't want to take the goodness of what your childhood brought you. That is in no way my intention. Like, I'm well with you holding that. And it does you no good to not also name the depravity. I actually think that God calls us to be honest about who our parents are.
Yeah.
The best way we can love our parents is actually to speak truth about them. And that means they're complex people. That means they come with lovely things, and they come also with ways in which they've harmed us. Both are true. And so when we're engaging people, especially in the context of like stories, what I found is I have to like almost invite them. The goodness that you did get, can you just put it on the shelf for a moment? Again, it's still there. It does not get to disappear when no one's taking it from you. But can we actually just sit with what the particularities of the harm are, the intentionality of the harm, what might be the purposefulness of the harm, because your freedom depends on that.
Yes. And why does my freedom depend on me seeing and looking honestly at the intentionality of how my parents harmed me? Why is that linked to my freedom?
If we don't name what is true about our parents, the depraved parts, the parts in which they intentionally harmed us, the parts in which they wounded us, if we actually don't engage those pieces, we then actually carry that in our body physically, and we hold ourselves responsible for things that we are never meant to hold ourselves responsible for. And it can keep us actually in bondage to a lifelong style of relating that is so not helpful for us. The other piece of this, Adam, is some people don't want to name some of the messiness, some of the harm, some of the intentional harm, because it might mean that we might have to look at our own depravity. I have had many experiences where, let's say I have brought a story of harm maybe by a parent, and I've had a participant defend my parent, like take the side of my parent even when they were harming me. And the reason they're doing this is not because they don't care about me, because I believe they do. They're doing that because they see themselves in my parent, and that feels way too uncomfortable to, in a sense, blame that parent. I think there's something about, we don't want to name what is true about our parents, because then we'll have to name what is true about us and our own parenting.
Yeah, and this is what Jesus means when he says, with the measure you use, it will be measured to you.
Absolutely. And I, having 5 children, my husband and I always tell our kids, we're like, listen, we have a college fund for you and we have a therapy fund for you. You will need both. When you realize the ways in which we've harmed you, like, you're going to want to talk to somebody about it, and it probably initially won't be us. And we are both well with you coming to us with the ways in which we hurt and wound you, intentionally and unintentionally, in order for us to actually work through repair, to grieve for the harm that we've caused.
And the bottom line is that many people don't want to name the intentionality of their parents' harm, because that means they might need to talk to them about it. And they know that there will be nothing approaching repair.
Yes. Yes. And that breaks my heart, but that's true. That's so true.
And we're not saying that you need to talk to your parents about it once you've named it, but internally, something inside says, if I'm going to call a spade, and my dad sexually abused me, and we're going to call it that, then there might be a time in the future when I go home for Thanksgiving and I just can't do the same song and dance anymore, and it's going to have to get talked about. And I have no hope that my dad, this might cost me my relationship with my dad.
Yes.
And although it's not a good relationship, at least we have something. But if I name it for what it is, I might not even have that.
Yes.
And I might lose my mother, and I might lose my brother.
Yes, absolutely. High risk, right?
Yeah.
High risk to speaking truth, high risk to naming what is true, high risk to naming intentionality to say, like, you saw my face.
Yeah.
You saw what happened to me. You knew what you were going to do and you did it anyway.
Right.
There's a high cost to that. It's true, like not a lot of our parents are going to be willing to repair in a way that will set us free. And so, which is why we need other people to actually tell our stories to like even take on the role of a loving parent that can attune, that can provide containment, like context, and that would be willing to like engage in a, like, that was wrong and it was not your fault. And my heart is grieved on behalf of what you endured.
So let's get practical here for a minute. What if we summon the courage to talk to mom about the ways she harmed me? And mom says, well, I certainly didn't mean to hurt you. I'm sorry you feel that way, sweetheart, but I've always loved you and I never meant to hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
Or what about this one? What about, I didn't realize I was hurting you? Mm-hmm. If mom says this, how can I hold her responsible? How can I say she was intentionally harming me when she's saying, no, I didn't know. I didn't mean to do it. Yep. It's not like I did that stuff on purpose, honey. Mm-hmm. If I could take it back, I would.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So hard. And I think what's hard is this, Adam, is that sometimes parents don't tell the truth.
And this is where you bring in the word self-deception.
Yes.
So why don't you say a little bit about what do you mean by self-deception?
All of us want to actually be seen as good people. What happens sometimes is, I think what we go throughout our whole day and we experience what I would call promptings. And a prompting is to do something or not do something that's consistent with who we want to be. So it could be as simple as, like, you have a prompt to hold a door open for the person behind you. It could be as simple as the prompt to say, I'm sorry when I've said something unkind to one of my kids. So we have prompts all day long to do things that are right, that are good, and that are consistent with the kind of people we want to be. What will normally happen is, for all human beings, is there's going to be times in which we want to honor the prompt, do the prompt. Like, it's not a big deal, like, no problem. But then there's these other times in which we actually don't want to. So we have a choice when we have prompts to either honor the prompt and do it or ignore it. Now, the problem with ignoring it is, as soon as we ignore a prompt to do something that's consistent with the kind of person we desire to be, we feel this kind of tension in our body because it's like, that's not who I want to be, and that's not who I want to be seen as. So we have to do something with that tension because it's too uncomfortable, really. So I think what we do is we create a new narrative. We create a new narrative as to why we're choosing not to honor the prompt.
Right. And so for the listeners, like, I want you to think about your mother or your father at the dinner table after you have been humiliated at school or betrayed by your friend group. You're a 7th grade girl. You're sitting at the table. Your face is fallen and your mother sees it.
Yes.
And your father sees it. And they know that your face is fallen and that you're not talking. And there is a prompt inside the heart of your mother to ask you, honey, what's wrong?
Yeah.
And she ignores the prompt for any of a million reasons.
Yep.
But she ignores it.
Mm-hmm.
That is the beginning of self-deception. Yes?
Absolutely. And even as you say this story, Adam, I can picture some of your audience going, well, maybe the mom's overwhelmed, or maybe she's tired, or maybe she's trying to get food on the table, right? There's so much justification for that, right?
Yep.
So this is where you're right. This is exactly where self-deception comes in. It is not a problem that the mom might have tired. All's good. What she does with her refusal to attend to her daughter's face, to her son's face, what she does with that can either be helpful or harmful.
Right.
if she ignores the prompt, like, and she still wants to hold that she's a good person, then the new narrative starts to form where it's like, you know what? She is always so overly sensitive when she comes home from school. Or I have had so many conversations with her about she's probably just upset because like a boy didn't talk to her, or whatever. Like what goes on in the mind of the mom to reorient the narrative instead of just saying, I see her face is sad and I'm exhausted and I feel really tired and I really don't want to engage in a long conversation, but I need to anyway, or can't, if I can honor that I don't want to, because that means I'm a human being, maybe I can engage honestly and say, you do look sad and I'm aware I'm making dinner and I have to go pick up your brother. And I'm wondering if maybe we can talk about this later. Right. Like that's an honoring of both what's going on with me as well as honoring what I'm saying. I'm just saying like that doesn't always happen that way, right? Because right. And so somebody could have a prompt to like protect a child and they choose not to. They can have a prompt to like manage their own anger because they know anger has come out sideways and it has harmed and they choose not to. A person can actually experience a prompt to withhold like a belittling comment and they choose not to. They can actually have a prompt that says, do not touch your child in an inappropriate way. And they do it anyway. They can have a prompt to stay with us so that we're not alone. And they ignore the prompt and they leave anyway. Parents have prompts to not use their children for emotional support, and they ignore those prompts anyway.
And over time, they have to rewrite the narrative of what's happening internally. And that rewriting of the narrative is what you're calling self-deception.
Self-deception.
Okay, we need to pause here because our conversation went so long that I broke it into 2 episodes. So thank you for listening to part 1. Tune in next time for part 2 of my interview with Cyndi Mesmer. And remember that new episodes release to the Place We Find Ourselves app 4 weeks before they are available on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else. So if you want to get episodes immediately, you have to go to my website and sign up for $3 per month or $30 per year. Please consider doing this. Your financial support keeps the podcast going. Thanks, and everyone have a great couple of weeks.